Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Caesar and Gaul, Making Waves by Historia Civilis. In the last couple of videos by Historia Civilis, we have been witnessing Caesar's conquest of Gaul, particularly his conquest of the Belgae, which are a tribe where modern-day Belgium is. We're basically seeing sort of the first wave of the Roman conquest and domination of Gaul as a whole. And presumably in this video we will continue to see that process. So yeah, I'm excited to jump into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you checked out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Without any further ado, let's jump into this one.
Over the winter of 57 and 56 BCE, Caesar had a decision to make. He was almost halfway through his 5-year term as the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum.
Yes, his governorship of 3 provinces, which as we covered in... Whoops, sorry, just hit the mic. Which as we covered in another video was exceptionally rare, and he only got that because the Senate was just desperate to get him out of Rome, and were willing to give him basically anything in order to make him leave and stop threatening their position.
If he had any post-governorship ambitions, he had to start making plans now. He could go back to the Senate and assume his place as a leader in the reform faction, but that wasn't nearly as exciting as being at the head of an army. Plus, throughout Caesar's life, we get hints that he didn't love the Senate. Remember, during his year as...
Yes, we get little hints that the relationship between Caesar and the Senate was not very good. The Senate, as we saw in the videos on Caesar in Rome, continually just tried to screw Caesar over, and he continually circumnavigated their attempts and came out victorious, which I'm sure frustrated the conservative Senate to no end. So yeah, they did not have a great relationship.
Consul, he did everything in his power to cut the Senate out of the legislative process.
Yeah.
He could run for consul again, but legally there had to be a 10-year gap between consulships, and the Senate wasn't likely to grant an exemption in his case. That put his next eligibility at 49 BCE at the earliest. Caesar sent for his triumvirs, his not-so-secret political allies, Pompey and Crassus. The 3 men met in a town...
And, we talked about this before, but it's a powerful alliance because Caesar is the young, popular reformist. He can garner popular support. Pompey is the well-respected, revered general. He can get support from people in positions of power, from respected politicians, and Crassus is the money. He is one of, if not the richest man in Rome at that time, and he can fund the operation. We have the 3 pieces of the puzzle. They fit together quite well, and this is why it was such a powerful political alliance.
Called Lucca in Cisalpine Gaul. This meeting, which is known to history as the Lucca Conference, has become the stuff of legend. Later writers would claim that hundreds of senators accompanied Pompey and Crassus on this pilgrimage, but this is probably a later invention.
Yeah, that seems extremely unlikely, them dragging hundreds of senators all the way up there. It just seems unlikely logistically, but also to have that level of support that you can bring that many people with you from Rome to a city further up north doesn't seem realistic.
When the 3 men met, Caesar had a proposal waiting for them. First, he wanted Pompey and Crassus to both run for consul. It was winter now, elections were usually held in the late summer, and if they were successful, they would assume office the following January. Second, once they were in office, Caesar wanted them to put forward legislation extending his term as governor. He was midway through a 5-year term now, and he wanted another 5 years added onto that. At the end of 10 years as governor, he would be eligible for another term as consul. Third, he wanted Pompey and Crassus to secure for themselves, with the support of Caesar's allies back in Rome, powerful governorships of their own. They agreed that Pompey would get both of the Spanish provinces, and Crassus would get the prestigious province of Syria. With all three triumvirs in charge of powerful provinces, they would each be able to focus on their own affairs and stay out of each other's hair. See, there were rumors circulating at the time that Crassus was secretly offering financial support to Clodius back in Rome. On paper, Clodius was an ally of Caesar's, but...
Yeah, I mean, we saw there was a whole video about Clodius, and he was basically a trouble-making reformer. He really disrupted the political order of Rome, in not necessarily a good way. He introduced a lot of political violence. He really destabilized the situation, and like Caesar in some ways, he tried to circumvent the power of the Senate at any opportunity he got. So Clodius, while not a consul, was a very powerful political figure in Rome.
in reality, the man was out of control. Remember, Clodius had indirectly come into conflict with Pompey over the issue of Cicero's banishment.
Right.
If this rumor was true and Crassus was financing this conflict, it means that the triumvirate was beginning to crumble.
Yeah, I mean, Clodius was a reformer, so supposedly would have been on the side of Caesar and, the triumvirate, but, I mean, he was a bit of a loose cannon, and he was very powerful for one man. I can see why they weren't necessarily, at least Pompey and Caesar, probably wouldn't have been comfortable with that. I mean, he did represent a challenge to their power. He was destabilizing the situation, and they couldn't necessarily predict or control what he would do next.
The three men agreed to this plan, and Pompey and Crassus returned home. The triumvirate wasn't just held together by political necessity, but also by a bunch of small personal connections. For instance, Crassus's son, Publius Crassus, was serving under Caesar in Gaul. Publius was probably in his late 20s, and too young for a command. But after the conference of Lucca, Caesar began to ignore convention and unofficially put him in charge of a legion anyway.
Yeah, I mean, personal connections were extremely important to politics at this time, and, I mean, personal connections have been important to politics throughout history. They still are important to politics. I mean, in every country, some more than others. But, they're particularly important here through political marriages, political adoptions, putting your kids or nephews or cousins into positions of power, having personal and particularly familial connections could really push you forward in Roman politics.
Anyway, this was probably done as a favor to old man Crassus. For the coming year, Caesar sent the young Crassus and his one legion deep into northwestern Gaul to secure some tacit support from the tribes in the region, with a non-violent show of force. He also sent another legion under the command of a legate named Galba to the Alps. By the way, this Galba's son's son's son would be a future Roman emperor. Galba's job was to set up permanent outposts, which would protect travelers from the Gauls living in the mountains. As it was now, traveling through the Alps was extremely dangerous, especially for traders. If Caesar was planning on being in Gaul for another 7+ years, he wanted to make it as easy as possible for goods to get in and out of Italy. While constructing one of these mountain outposts, Galba's legion was attacked by the native Gauls, and for a time they were completely surrounded.
Uh-oh.
But Galba kept his cool and broke out in a surprise attack, which won him the day. With one legion busy establishing a safe route through the Alps, and another legion making peace with tribes in northwestern Gaul, Caesar in his commentaries says that Gaul was reduced to a state of tranquility.
Yeah, so once again, and we've covered this in past videos, we're seeing the, Roman domination of Gaul. The Romans are, slowly, not that slowly, but, not that quickly over the course of a couple years, moving in, winning battles, and taking over. It's not just beating Gallic tribes. and winning big victories, it's doing stuff like this. It's setting up forts. It's making these shows of force. It's camping in Gaul in the winter. It's showing that the Romans are in charge here now, and the Roman presence is permanent, and really impressing that idea upon the Gauls. And that's what Caesar's doing.
This marks a bit of a turning point in Rome's relationship with Gaul. Caesar was no longer simply reacting to events. He was behaving as if Rome was there to stay. Permanently.
Exactly.
But Gaul's tranquility couldn't last forever. In northwestern Gaul, the young Crassus had established diplomatic relations with many of the tribes in the region, and accepted hostages from them as a sign of good faith. The hostages weren't kept in cages or anything, they just lived with the Romans, and were used as collateral if anything weird happened. This was normal practice in the ancient world, especially when a powerful state bumped up against a weak one. Some of these hostages were from a tribe called the Veneti. The young Crassus later sent diplomats to the Veneti to negotiate the purchase of some grain. When they arrived, the Veneti arrested the diplomats and took them as hostages of their own. Who knows why they did this? They may have seen it as a fair exchange for the hostages taken by Rome. They may have been annoyed with the Romans for showing up and acting like they owned the place. It could have been a simple misunderstanding.
Or it could very well be something that we do not know anything about. We have no idea what exactly happened. We don't have many accounts of the goings-on here, and the accounts we do have are Roman. We don't have... maybe we do. I'd be very surprised, I'll put it that way, if we had the Veneti account of what happened in that scenario and what is about to happen. I presume they're going to get crushed by the Romans. I don't know. I guess we'll see. But we don't have the Veneti perspective, so we don't know what they were thinking, what they were doing, what happened. We have very limited sources, and, they're from the Roman perspective. So we sort of have to consider that when we're looking at sources and trying to tell history.
Either way, I think it's pretty clear that this was a minor diplomatic incident. But when Caesar got word of this, he chose to interpret the act as a formal declaration of war and a full-blown Gallic uprising. He immediately ordered a fleet of ships built on a river that led to the Atlantic Ocean and mobilized his entire army. He sent a message to the young Crassus, telling him to move south and continue establishing contact with the tribes there. With that done, he ordered 3 fresh legions to northwestern Gaul to stop any neighboring tribes from aligning themselves with the Veneti.
This is very typical of Caesar. Caesar, he was the type of guy who just needed an excuse. With his conquests in Gaul, or, anything. You gave him an excuse, he would go right in. He saw some misbehavior from a tribe, or... whether true or made up, if it gave him a reason to go in, fight, conquer more territory, he would do it. That's how Caesar operated.
Then he instructed Labienus to go with 1 legion to the newly pacified Belgae territory, just in case they took this opportunity to try something.
Smart.
This left Caesar with 3 legions for himself. He told his river fleet to start moving toward the Atlantic Ocean whenever they were ready, and marched off.
We can see from this alone how Caesar is now treating Gaul like it's Rome's territory. He's not only worried about, defeating this one tribe, which he feels slighted by. He's sending his men all across Gaul. He's sending Labienus to Belgae territory to make sure they don't rise up. That is not the behavior of a general operating necessarily in, unfamiliar foreign territory. This is someone who's operating in territory which they have some ownership of. And that's what Caesar's doing. He's claiming this territory for Rome.
He would deal with the Veneti personally. The Veneti specialized in sea trade, so when they heard that there was a bunch of angry Romans coming their way, their first instinct was to load everybody onto their giant sailing ships and get out of there. They watched from just offshore as Caesar came across their abandoned villages and systematically burned them to the ground. What the Veneti didn't expect was for a Roman fleet to appear seemingly out of nowhere. Roman
And to be fair, that was probably a reasonable assumption. They wouldn't have expected a Roman fleet around this area. Not to mention that the Romans were they never focused on their navy over their army. They were always more focused on ground troops. They were never that great on the sea. So it was probably a fair assumption that, we can, enter our ships, sort of anchor off the coast and be safe at least for a certain period of time.
ships were tiny things with oars, designed for going back and forth across the Mediterranean. While the Veneti ships were these monsters with giant sails, designed for long-distance travel in the Atlantic Ocean. The Roman ships attacked, but they quickly discovered that the Veneti ships were too sturdy to ram and too tall to board normally. But they were able to figure out that they could pull up alongside them and pull down the Veneti rigging with big hooks on poles, preventing them from sailing away. After that, it was only a matter of time before the Romans figured out how to climb onto the Veneti ships. Caesar's army watched from the shore as the Romans destroyed the Veneti fleet. The surviving Veneti surrendered to Caesar unconditionally. He had their entire ruling council put to death. And
wow.
Everybody else, he sold into slavery.
Oh my, Jesus. I mean, Caesar is never, well, not never, but he's often not very lenient, but this might be the harshest treatment of an enemy I've seen for him. This is extremely brutal.
This was an unthinkably harsh punishment for something so small.
Yeah.
This caused an uprising by some of the neighboring tribes, but these were put down by the 3 legions stationed nearby. Try to notice the subtle change that had taken place here. Caesar isn't positioning his legions as if he's a general marching through enemy territory. He's moved in.
Okay, yeah. I don't even need to speak my thoughts because Historia Civilis we'll get to them a couple minutes later. I'll let him speak, but he's saying exactly what I was saying a bit earlier.
Enforcing the peace.
Right.
With only
he's not a conquering general in foreign territory. He's occupying the territory. He's ruling over it. He's treating it like it's already his. He's putting down rebellions. He's stationing troops in different places. Historia Civilis is exactly right. You can see sort of that shift taking place over these last 2 or 3 years in Gaul.
A short time left in the campaigning season, Caesar marched toward Belgae territory. There had been a small uprising there as well, which Labienus had successfully put down. The thing that still bothered Caesar was that there were 2 tribes around modern Calais that he said never formally made peace with him after he subdued the Belgae. In Caesar's mind, they were still at war. This is a pretty weak excuse to march all the way across Gaul.
It's what I was saying earlier, any excuse. You give Caesar any excuse to do what he wants, and he'll take it.
Even if it was true, these people did literally nothing to provoke him. When Caesar arrived, these villages were abandoned as well. They must have heard what happened to the Veneti. The Romans set up their camp in a forested area, and all of a sudden, without warning, they were attacked.
Wow.
The Roman infantry didn't even have time to assemble, and just got into random groups, and formed a line of defense as fast as they could. They took heavy losses, but they held, and it's a small miracle that they weren't completely overrun.
A small miracle combined with elite Roman training and discipline. They weren't even ready in this situation. There are a lot of examples of Roman troops being ambushed, but as they almost always did, they managed to stand their ground. I've mentioned this before, but Roman infantry, some of the most elite troops around, trained well disciplined, and they knew how to stand their ground and push back the enemy. Pretty simple, but they were some of the best.
Gauls fell back, and the Romans gave chase into the woods. Caesar notes that in the woods, his men suffered even heavier losses. This
Yikes.
implies that the Romans may have been led into further ambushes, but Caesar glosses over this.
Of course he does. And that's Historia Civilis touching on the issues we have with our sources. If we had a perspective, a source from that tribe, then we would be able to, sort of take the two sources and work out exactly, what had happened, at least a bit more accurately. Or if even we had a Roman source that wasn't Caesar's personal account, we might get a bit more of an honest look at it, but we don't. So we have to work with what we've got.
In the days that followed, Caesar turned this temporary camp into a permanent one by clear-cutting the trees surrounding the camp for visibility and having additional walls built for defense.
Wow.
With Caesar finally satisfied that his boot was firmly on Gaul's neck, he turned his army around and marched south for the winter. He had big plans, but they wouldn't bear fruit until next year.
Alrighty. Well, that was a good video. And I think it really is interesting to see the transition that Historia Civilis pointed out, as we've seen in the last few videos. In only a couple years, Caesar really has gone from, a general operating in foreign territory to, sort of a conquering general who is operating as if the territory is his own. He's setting up bases, he's stationing his men around Gaul, he's putting down rebellions, he's, making sure that rebellions don't happen in the first place. Now, I'm not condoning Caesar's treatment of the Gallic peoples. It's not good at all. Caesar was very brutal, and a lot of this stuff is really, really horrific. His treatment of the Veneti, that's extremely harsh and brutal. So it's certainly not good, but it does show how capable Caesar was. It is impressive in that sense, just him managing to achieve that. Even though, like I said, morally we're not on the right side of things. But yeah, I enjoyed this one. I hope you guys did. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the Patreon. It's linked down below. I've got exclusive reactions on there. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.